So good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for coming out. I'm Lawrence Douglas. I teach in the Department of Law, Jurisprudence, and Social Thought. And welcome to the second of the three-part point-counterpoint events for this semester. This series of conversations is made possible by a generous gift of the members of the 50th reunion class of 1970. And the idea is to support public conversations in the hope of bridging the partisan divides in our nation and to help us think more carefully about the most important issues facing us today. And this year's theme is democracy at the crossroads, and it is linked to the first year seminar called Progress, in which roughly about 15% of Amherst first year students are presently enrolled. Our first event featured Congressman Jamie Raskin, the Democratic representative from the state of Maryland. And on November 8th, just this coming Tuesday, Election Day, same time, same place, we will be hosting Danielle Allen, professor at Harvard, where she is also the director of the Edmund and Lily Safra Center for Ethics. So you're all encouraged to come again on Tuesday night. Tonight, we are, of course, honored and delighted to have with us George Packer. George is a writer of extraordinary range, sensitivity, and intelligence. He has worn the hats of novelist, of playwright, and journalist, and he is perhaps best known for his works of nonfiction, which include, and here's my little show and tell, The Assassin's Gate, America in Iraq, which to my mind is absolutely the finest journalistic account of our benighted war and occupation of that country, and it was the recipient of the Cornelius Ryan Prize. He is the author, next in the show and tell, of The Unwinding, an inner history of the New America, which won both the National Book Award and the National Book Critics Circle Award. He's also author of Our Man, Richard Holbrooke, and the End of American Century, which, Nishi, do you have there to hold up for show and tell?
Yeah. It's very heavy.
Yes, very nice, very nice. And then most recently, Last Best Hope, America in Crisis and Renewal, parts of which many of you have already read in advance of tonight's conversation. George has received many other awards and distinctions, but I won't embarrass him or overly fuel my own envy by listing them all. He is formerly a staff writer at The New Yorker and now is a staff writer at The Atlantic Monthly. And we are absolutely delighted and honored to have him. So please join me in welcoming Herbert Packer to Amherst.
George Packer.
Did I say Herbert?
You said Herbert.
Wow.
That was my father's name. I'm a different person from my father.
And I have to say,
thank you.
Your father was a prominent legal scholar, and I used to teach his works.
Well, that should be the topic tonight.
Wow.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for that,
Right.
Lawrence. Thanks for confusing me with my father.
Yes, exactly. Right.
It's every boy's dream.
Right. I wonder if you could maybe just start off tonight. I know some of the students have already heard this, but for others who weren't there this morning, a lot of what you have written about is unraveling, about the fraying of America. And one of the ways you characterize the tensions in the United States is you don't necessarily, in this most, what we might say is not irrational, but let's say non-rational beliefs with rational arguments. And the degree to which, there's a lot of conspiracy theory out there. There's a lot of disinformation. And is that an adequate kind of response to kind of engage on the level of criticism, or do we need to kind of rethink how we deal with the prevalence of something like conspiracy theories in the United States?
No, I have no problem with saying that's a
recent book. Look at it in terms of matters of class or race, but matters of narrative. And I wonder if you could maybe just talk to us a little bit why you think narrative was a helpful way of making sense of the divisions that we find in America today, And without necessarily going into that much great detail, just talk a little about the divisions, these narrative divisions that you do find in the country.
Right, because we're all just horribly familiar with the nature of our divisions. They've been studied ad infinitum. Every election seems to confirm them. I'm sure next week will again. We're divided red and blue. We're divided rural and urban. We're divided educated and less educated. We're divided racially, although less than most of us thought before 2020. I'm interested in all of that, but I'm interested mostly in what idea of the country and its identity inspires these divisions. Why is there such a gap? And why does the gap seem existential? Like neither side can imagine America as including all of these groups. Why is it, my side or death, which is what elections have essentially become? So for that, you really need to get beyond demographics. You need to get to what Richard Rorty calls the moral identity of the country. What are we? Who are we? What are we supposed to be about? What's our identity? What's our future? What do we want to see our future? And so when I sat down in the apocalyptic year 2020 to think this through, I began to think that red and blue is too simple, because red has two different clashing ideas. And once you think of that way, you see it all the time in all kinds of ways. And blue has two clashing ideas, and you see that all the time. And to be very brief and simple, the red clash is between an older, more elite idea of America as being free America, which was how Reagan described the country. We are a country of free individuals who should be liberated from government's heavy hand to pursue our dreams, and also to allow in people from the rest of the world who want to pursue their dreams, because back then the Republican Party was pro-immigration. You may not know that, but that was the policy position of the Republicans. And that view, that free America idea has gradually been supplanted by a different idea on the right, which in some ways has very few of the policy positions that the old free America narrative had. What I call real America, put quotes around that, is not about freeing the individual to pursue his or her talents and dreams. It's about who really belongs here, who are the true Americans. And according to Real America, which is a phrase that originated with Sarah Palin and was brought to the White House with Donald Trump, Real America is essentially the white Christian heartland of the country, not the non-white Americans, the immigrants, and not the elites in the cities. They are not real. That was what Sarah Palin essentially said, and what has become kind of the assumption of the Republican Party, that there are certain Americans who really are almost like internal aliens, even traitors. This is why violence is such a palpable presence in our politics today, because it's not about policy ideas, it's about identity. And identity as a political dividing line leads to violence, because it's me or you, it's my team or your team, my side or your side. And on the blue side, a similar division, generational, between what I call smart America, which is the America of the Clintons and of Barack Obama, the America that believed in education as the key to the good life. Globalization is a good thing because it leads to the exchange of ideas and of people open to the future, open to technology, to novelty. essentially meritocracy as the measure of your worth and of whether you will succeed or not, which is judged by your SAT scores, which college you go to, which profession you enter. Education is the only path to a good life. And the final of these four, what I call Just America, which is a rebellion among younger people against these other narratives, and which holds that America is not an equal opportunity society. It's not a melting pot. It's not a union that is never perfect but getting more perfect all the time, as Barack Obama told us, but instead is fixed permanently in a hierarchy of groups which are either oppressor or oppressed, and which is born in slavery and in a sense has never really escaped the original sin. So those four groups, those four narratives seem to me a more cogent way of understanding political behavior than simply looking at people's demographics and deciding this is who they are, this is what group they belong to, this is how they're going to vote. Because people are constantly surprising the pollsters. For example, in 2020, who would have thought, and no journalist would have told you, that Trump's support among Black and Hispanic Americans would go up over 2016, and among white Americans would go down. If you were immersed in media, you would have thought just the opposite. But it didn't happen because narratives have a powerful hold over people in a way that simply understanding what demographic they belong to does not. And so Last Best Hope, part of it is an attempt to kind of understand where these narratives come from and how they interact and how they affect each other, because they're all coming out of the same society. They're all part of the same social order, and all of us may in some way belong to more than one of them at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Did you want to follow up?
Yeah, so I wanted to sort of ask you about, well, some of the suggestions, one in particular, for how to heal the wounds that we have, the divides that, are breaking us apart. And I felt like the chief idea you had towards the end of Last Best Hope was that we have too much inequality. We should seek to achieve equality. And I sort of have two questions about that. Let me just ask the first one.
Okay.
When you talked about equality, I wasn't completely sure what you meant. So you start by saying you don't mean equality of outcomes. But then you talk about equality of opportunity, creating an even playing field, a fair playing field. But then you say that's not all that we need for equality.
Right.
And that's when I started to get a little bit unclear about what you meant. It sounded, by the end of your discussion, it sounded like you meant, well, not too much inequality.
Right.
Is the way I read it. So I just wondered if you could expand on that. And then the second question I had was just, I wanted to see how you might convince specifically the people who really believe in freedom, and specifically economic freedom,
Right.
why they should go for equality.
And I'd say the simple answer is when inequality becomes so extreme that the zip code into which you're born determines the rest of your life, and that is more and more the case in this country, equal opportunity is a mirage. It's a mirage. And that's why meritocracy, the system by which all of you are here, has come under so much scrutiny and criticism, because thoughtful people are asking, what is meritocracy? Are the best truly being rewarded for their talent and hard work? Or are you more likely to be born a meritocrat than to achieve it yourself? And a lot of statistics say you're more likely to be born a meritocrat. Social mobility in this country has dropped below the levels in most of Europe. We used to be the most socially mobile, that is to say, equal opportunity country in the world. And that's not true anymore. And that's partly because of the income inequality that I think was the result of the policies of free America, Reagan's America, and partly because education has become such a crucial dividing line between those who succeed and those who fail. And we know that if you're poor, the chances of entering the elite world of education is extremely small. The statistics show it's as small as it was in the 1950s, with all of the efforts at equal opportunity that have been a part of the work of the elite colleges. It is no better for poor kids than it was 70 years ago. That means there is now a permanent class of elites, and it's hard to fall out of that class. Your parents are more likely to marry people of the same social class. That means you're going to be born into a zip code where there are good schools and where those schools are going to propel you into better schools, et cetera, et cetera. You all know this. Some of you know it because you've lived it. Some of you know it because you didn't live it and you had to fight your way into it. But you know how hard it is to fight your way into it. So equality in America has never meant, in political terms, equal outcomes. But when the outcomes are so unequal that we have permanent classes, essentially an aristocracy of the educated, then equality becomes a kind of fiction. And so equal opportunity is highly questionable. And therefore, to me, it's not enough to just say, let's level the playing field by breaking down all the barriers to success. There has to be something more. And in the book, I have a whole bunch of ideas at the end that I think are part of the fifth narrative that I think is a healthier one, which I call Equal America, which includes breaking up corporate monopolies, empowering workers, empowering the bottom 60% of the income ladder, making school something that isn't based entirely on property values, which is the way we fund schools today, and which it reinforces the aristocracy that I'm talking about. And other ideas too, which we could get into. But as I said this morning, I'm not as convinced of my own ideas as I should be, because inequality and polarization are so entrenched that I don't quite believe anyone who claims to have the answer. These are such deep problems and ongoing problems that I'm going to be skeptical of any 10-point plan, including my own.
Can I just ask you about one of those ideas? Because I thought you had this interesting thought. I'm going to make it sound a little paradoxical. The people, because you think that what we need to do is, right, reach all four Americas, try to convince them, try to persuade them. And when I think about the people you call the free America, the people who believe in economic freedom, they think that means free markets. But you argue in your book that actually economic freedom requires regulation of the market. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Right, because freedom, in my definition, is the freedom to control your own destiny. And if you are poor, and if you are locked out of the information economy, and if you grow up in a place where no one goes to college, freedom is a kind of the taste of ashes in your mouth. Yes, you're free. No one is keeping you from starting a business or from becoming, a doctor, but is that real freedom? There's a quote from John Dewey that I will be very hard pressed to reproduce here, but that basically says freedom is the power to have a place in the political and economic life of your society. It's not simply the absence of restraints. That's the libertarian idea of freedom, the absence of restraints. And to me, that is not real freedom. That's a kind of childish version of freedom, which says as long as everything is out of my way, I will then be able to master my destiny. Is life like that, really? I think libertarianism is a kind of childish ideology because it doesn't understand that life is actually full of barriers to your ability to be the master of your destiny. And instead, we are all part of a society. In that society, some have economic and political power, some do not. The more power you have, the more free you are. And that's why I don't think simply removing restraints of taxes, regulation, government interference, all the promises of Reaganism is freeing. And the proof is in the data. Look at what's happened to large parts of this country in the years since the 80s, which was the heyday of free America. What we've got is huge gaps between parts of the country where universities and hospitals and tech companies are creating economic opportunity. Those are mostly in the cities and on the coasts. And the parts of the country that were the heart of industry or agriculture, the old economy, and where those things are no longer available. That is the huge gap in our economy between the old industrial and the new information economy. And the promises of free America have not solved that. In fact, they've made it far worse. Income inequality, wealth inequality, social mobility, all of the indicators have gotten worse in the last 30 or 40 years. And I think a large part of the reason is that's actually not the answer. In fact, if you look at tax cuts, does wealth inequality improve? Does employment numbers improve during periods of tax cuts? No. No, in fact, the opposite. The most impressive numbers of inequality collapsing and employment expanding was during the Clinton years of the 90s, in which tax cuts on the rich went up. So whatever the cargo cult repeats over and over again about tax cuts, it simply is belied by the data. The thing is, the Republican Party is no longer really the party of tax cuts. That's sort of the cream at the top of the elite of the party, but the base of the party, the energy of the party, is not about tax cuts at all. It's not really about freedom. It's about who's a real American and what do we do about those people who are not real Americans. It's much more about identity and the grievances that come with identity.
But it does manifest itself in a somewhat paradoxical politics, doesn't it? I mean, in the sense that you might think that real America would be rebelling against free America. And yet you see that that real America is actually willing to, as long as, let's say, the GOP uses this kind of xenophobic, nationalistic, white supremacist rhetoric, people are willing to vote for tax cuts for billionaires. And it's kind of a very interesting phenomenon that people are acting, in a sense, against their class interests. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the way in which one might think that given the inequalities we see, that there would be a kind of real class unity as opposed to this willingness actually to side with the tax breaks for billionaires.
Well, first of all, Trump in 2016 ran on what? Keeping Social Security, keeping Medicare, having the greatest health care for all. Those were among his policies. Cutting taxes on billionaires, cutting the capital gains loophole for hedge funds. In other words, he had a kind of left-wing economic policy. And of course, ending the trade deals that he said were hollowing out the heartland of the country. This was not free America. It was the opposite of free America. And so in some ways, Trump and Bernie Sanders sounded kind of alike. Is that why Trump got elected? I don't think so. I think he got elected because he played to xenophobia, to bigotry, to the fear of others coming in and taking Americans' place. And that's the problem with an economic policy campaign. The Democrats are seeing this right now as they head toward what will probably be a fairly big defeat next week. They think that if they just point out that Joe Biden passed the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Act, which created jobs, et cetera, and is bringing blue-collar jobs back to the heartland, that somehow the working class, the white working class, will come back to the Democrats. You might think so, but what are the most important issues on which people vote? I've seen data that shows it's not about tax cuts. It's not about spending on jobs. It's not about economics. It's about cultural issues, identity issues, which are so much more sensitive to the manipulations of politicians, and which the Trump wing of the Republican Party's learned how to manipulate. So I don't think it works, and it doesn't. It's also, there's something about saying you're voting against your interests that if I were a voter and I heard that from a candidate, I'd be pissed off.
Yeah.
Like, how do you know what my interests are? Maybe immigration is my interest. Maybe abortion is my interest. Maybe education is my interest. Maybe I don't just want to get as much money as I can from the government. So who among the wealthy, educated, liberal class just votes on their interests? If they did, they vote for Republicans, because Republicans are going to cut their taxes, but they don't. The educated class has become the base of the Democratic Party, not because of their economic interests, but because they have a larger sense of what their interests are. So I don't think it works to tell people, you're actually wrong, you're voting against yourself, you should really wise up.
Yep.
Maybe I'll switch to talking about, I want to ask you a question about free speech and self-censorship. So I think towards the end of Last Best Hope, here's what you say of the new generation of journalists. Lacking the power to censor, some use the power to shame, intimidate, and ostracize, even turning it on their own colleagues. But in essence, they are asking for their own destruction. Can you explain that last part? How are they asking for their own destruction?
I'm a journalist, I'm a writer, and as soon as I start drawing lines around what I think is acceptable speech, I'm setting in motion the process by which someone else is going to tell me that my speech is not acceptable. And at that point, I will no longer have a job, a calling. Free speech is, in some ways, a complicated issue, and I know it's contested on college campuses, it's contested in newspapers and magazines. But what worries me is an increasing trend toward associating speech with action, even with violence, and therefore having a grounds for saying this speech is unacceptable. And to me, it's a slippery slope. As soon as you have declared that words produce harm, harm is violence, violence is unacceptable, you've opened up the field to anyone who wants to say, your words are harming me. Look at what the state of Florida is doing. Their legislature has considered a bill that will claim that any teaching that makes students feel uncomfortable about who they are, race, gender, anything, is illegal. What are the implications for teaching? What are the implications for free speech? They're pretty drastic. But where did that idea come from? Sorry to say, it came from the left. It came from a long-term project, which has now become quite widespread and even the norm among a lot of people, to consider speech to be another form of action and a potential form of harm and violence. That can be used by either side. And once it's out of the bag, it's going to be abused by both sides. I've seen it in my own profession where a kind of social pressure, there's no laws against it. There aren't even written rules. It's social pressure, moral pressure to watch what you say becomes pressure you impose on yourself. Self-censorship, which is the most potent kind of censorship, far more than state censorship, because the thought police are now in your own head. And once they're in your head, you're going to keep yourself from saying some things and eventually from thinking some things. And then you have an immense block against thought. And it's not just that you're going to be not thinking the wrong thoughts. You're not going to be thinking. Because when you impose a block against thinking, it's indiscriminate. It becomes a kind of gag on your own thoughts and words. For a writer, I don't know that I need to say why that's death. It's a kind of destruction of your ability. There's a line from George Orwell's essay, The Prevention of Literature. The imagination, like certain wild animals, cannot breed in captivity. In other words, once you have imposed limits on yourself for what you can think, even thoughts you know are bad, there are going to be limits on what you can say and create, and eventually you will sterilize yourself as a creator, as an artist, as someone who thinks and speaks and writes. You can't make it a fine distinction between this thought and that thought. It's going to block all your thoughts. And eventually, all you're going to be able to do is spout acceptable jargon, cliches, the words you know are expected by other people, and then you have a kind of deadness of discourse, which unfortunately I see happening more and more in our society. I think social media is playing a part in this, because it's on social media that you feel the pressure to censor yourself so strongly, since the consequences of not doing so can be so dire.
So, I mean, I think this is surprisingly a tricky thing. It seems like obvious we should not shame, intimidate, and ostracize people for what they say and write. But, I mean, even you, like a few pages later, you say that.
Uh-oh, he's got me now.
Yeah, this is the gotcha.
You hate to hear that. A few pages later, you say,
point, counterpoint, dude. That journalists should expose, isolate, and discredit far-right views. And I wonder, like, how can you expose and discredit someone's views without shaming them? And how can you isolate someone without ostracizing them?
So then the question is, what's the difference between criticism and canceling? Because they're different. They're different. To me, criticism is mostly aimed at the thought, not the person. It's an attempt to correct a wrong thought, a harmful thought, a completely unsupported thought, or even a thought that may just be sort of flabby and weak and needs to be improved. That's criticism. Canceling is aimed at the person. And the idea is not to improve it or to open up the space of what we can think by showing the weakness of this thought and the strength of that thought. It's to narrow the space of what we can think by threatening the person with a kind of public death. And that's why I don't think the few pages later is necessarily completely at odds with what I had said before. I'm moving from critical thinking to canceling. The first is essential in a democracy. And this whole section, by the way, Nishi, is about what are the skills you need to be a citizen in a democracy. These are things you are not born knowing. These are things that are hard to learn and that are somehow unnatural. It's really unnatural to sit there and listen to someone with whom you profoundly disagree and argue with them. Instead, you want to kill them. The natural thing is to want to kill them. It's unnatural to think that even when you're right, the majority view should prevail. That's totally unnatural. And in historical terms, it's a blip. Self-government is a blip. It's hard. Most people don't want to govern themselves. Let someone else do it. Too much trouble. Let Vladimir Putin do it. Let Donald Trump do it. The skills that we need to govern ourselves are hard to learn and easily lost. Tocqueville called them habits of the heart. I fear that we've lost our habits of the heart as a self-governing people. And one of them is to be able to criticize without canceling, to be able to level a 21-gun barrage of criticism at an idea without trying to take out the person and remove them from the field, because I'm not sure that actually solves the problem. So that's why I think those two are actually compatible with each other as essentially democratic skills that we need to hold on to, or we need to relearn if we've lost them.
Thanks.
And yet on the very next page,
Oh.
just kidding, actually. No, just kidding. One way of reading your...
You say I contradict myself?
Right.
Very well, I contradict myself.
One way of reading the Four Americas is you might have thought that Just America and Real America are about as far apart as you could possibly imagine.
Yeah.
And yet, interestingly, I think one of the upshots from your discussion is this kind of similarities that one finds between Just America and Real America. So I wonder if maybe you could talk a little about that, what looks like polar opposite positions that bear certain, maybe perhaps disturbing similarities.
Well, here's one little example. Take two members of Congress, AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Marjorie Taylor Greene. What do they have in common? Well, 3 names. And they are pursuing their careers in Congress in the same way. How? By building a brand, by distinguishing themselves from the establishment of their party, by shocking, by lots of symbolism and gestures, not by crafting legislation that they are going to do the hard work of building a coalition in order to get it passed. In other words, they're more like Twitter celebrities than like congresswomen. They just happen to belong to those two opposed groups. I think AOC comes out of Just America. MTG belongs to Real America, but their attitude toward politics is rather similar. And it's a kind of tear it apart in order to create space for an idea so extreme that it's not going to fly if you are working through the normal paths of the institution. And so in a similar way, Just in Real America, of course, the culture wars is all about the war between those two, but they need each other. They feed on each other. It's a kind of eternal cycle in which one takes one position, the other shows how extreme it is and takes an even more extreme position. The first then points out how extreme that position is. Without that, what would their political power be? Because they're not interested in passing laws that a majority can get behind and that you need to build a coalition to get passed across different viewpoints. They're not interested in persuasion. They're not interested in compromise. They're interested in flaming. And culturally, they have a lot of power. And politically, they have some power. But I don't see them as having an interest in actual change, because change in this country always means talking to people you don't like. It always means trying to find a way to get people who might think they're against you to come over to your side. It is rare that change comes by one outlying position forcing the rest to go along. It happens. There are examples. The civil rights movement is a great example. It was an outlier that became the position of the Democratic Party and of enough Republicans that civil rights legislation passed. But it's pretty rare, I think, in this country. And so I see Real and Just America as both being rebellions against the kind of complacency that set in both parties, free and smart, on some of the basic questions. And instead, they want to disrupt. They want to make trouble.
Yeah, maybe I would follow up. I have some thought about that, but maybe I just want to ask something about, you talked about really trying to create political solutions, that neither of them are really interested in political solutions. In the conversation that we had this morning, you seemed to express a lot of doubts about the capacity of Washington. I think you described our federal government now as, as terminally dysfunctional, I think is the term that you used this morning.
Do you disagree?
No, I don't necessarily disagree. But I think one of the things is I think a number of members in the audience are taking a course on the Constitution.
Yeah.
And one of the things I think that we've observed in that course is the way in which, for all its greatness, the Constitution now almost becomes a roadblock, an obstacle to political compromise. You talked this morning about the country being so passionately and evenly divided, and yet it seems like in many ways it's not. If you look at things like gun control, overwhelming majority of Americans support it. Climate change legislation, overwhelming majority support it. Even progressive tax increases on the wealthy, overwhelming number of people support it, and yet we're incapable of doing it because of structural features of our politics. So I was wondering if you might want to talk a little about that.
Yeah, it's a great question. Have we become an undemocratic country where the structures, the Senate, the Electoral College, the gerrymandered state legislatures, the distribution of voters between the cities and the exurban areas have begun to favor Republicans, so that even if there's a majority in the city, they're just not going to elect as many representatives as the non-urban areas. Have all of those, and the Supreme Court, which is the least democratic branch of government, have all of these things become anti-democratic obstacles to the will of the majority? Okay, so that's, I think, a very compelling position. And on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I have that position. But like on the other days of the week, I'm asking myself, if that's the case, why are the Democrats not going to win the House of Representatives next week? It's not just because of the distribution of voters between the cities and the exurban areas. It's because they have lost enough support that Republicans will win the majority most likely. So I feel that that is both a compelling argument for God knows what, throwing out the Constitution and starting over, because the Senate isn't going anywhere. To get rid of the Senate, you need 2/3 of the states to vote to get rid of the Senate. Do you think 2/3 of the states would vote to get rid of a body that favors states with fewer people? No way in the world. The Electoral College, pretty hard to get rid of that too. Gerrymandering, the Supreme Court has said, not our problem. If the state legislatures gerrymander, the people have to figure out a way around it. In other words, the fixes are really hard, but I also fear that the argument is distracting Americans from the imperative to create a majority. Because even if Democrats have a slight advantage in national votes, for example, the election of 2020, it's not that big, and it can easily flip. It's not so big that inflation or some other contingent issue of the moment isn't going to flip it, which means you're actually trying to solve the problem by changing the rules when the real problem is you just can't create a majority big enough to get your ideas passed. And that's why I think the ability to create a majority, which always means compromise, coalitions, figuring out which issues matter most to voters, is the healthier, the way that's likelier to shore up democracy rather than tear it apart. Because imagine a constitutional convention. What would it be like? It wouldn't just be Bernie Sanders and his crew at the Constitution. There would be Matt Gaetz, or however the hell you pronounce his name. He would have his crew at the Constitutional Convention too. And they might be claiming that the state of Florida should actually run the country. I mean, who knows what could happen? Yeah. So I'd rather not start over. As with all the flaws, it's not the worst possible scenario, whereas I can imagine some pretty bad scenarios if we start over. I think the answer to climate change, to income inequality, to guns, is to find a way to beat the hell out of the other side, whichever side you're on. It's not easy in this country, but I feel like it's a bit of a shortcut to think you can get around that by claiming that the rules and the structures are rigged against you and they need to be changed.
Maybe one more, and then we'll open it up to...
Should I ask the Holbrook question? Let me ask, I'm going to ask you about this heavy, big biography of...
But it's fun.
But
Right, well,
very eminently readable.
Well, I didn't know much about Richard Holbrook. I bet a lot of people don't. I knew he was a diplomat. Jeez. Yeah. But, I mean, he never made it to be Secretary of State. You yourself say he was almost great. So I wasn't thinking of picking up this book, but then I read your prologue, and it was riveting. And I just want to read a little bit of it and have you ask you a little bit to expand on it. So basically, I'm asking you to sell this book. So you say...
It's too late, I'm afraid. Go ahead.
So you say, we want to see and feel what happened to America during Holbrook's life. And we can see and feel more clearly by following someone who is almost great, because his quest leads us deeper down the alleyways of power than the usual famous subjects, and his boisterous struggling lays open more human truths than the composed annals of the great. Just wonder whether, you could tell us, like, why did you decide to write this book?
I mean, that kind of says it. I was given his papers by his widow, so that was like the immediate reason. But even then, I could have gone through them and said, why would I give 4 years of my life to this? There's a lot of great man and great woman biographies, and I find them boring. You find out where they were born, who their parents were, as Holden Caulfield says, all that David Copperfield kind of crap, if you all know that line. There's a sort of dutiful march through the archives of this person, because this person's important enough that we need to march through their archives. Why should a reader have to march through anyone's archives? Our lives are too short. What you want is a book that makes you feel like you're reading a yarn, a novel, a gripping tale. And Holbrook, who was both the best and worst of men, who was an idealist and a brutal realist, who ended a war in Bosnia and was horrible to his wives and to his colleagues and to lots of people, has like the character that you actually can get into regardless of his resume and accomplishments. So he was never Secretary of State. Maybe that's better, because once they reach the heights of power, something kind of turns to marble. They become like a marble figure, and you have to write about them. Everyone already kind of knows the story, so you have to go through all the familiar events and give them your own little spin based on the dutiful research you've done, and it's all very boring. And I found this book, when I was confronting it, really boring. Like, why am I doing this? And then the first sentence popped into my head, I don't know if, can I read the first paragraph? Because this is kind of like, this is why I wrote this book.
And yet on the next page, you were,
Hey.
So, Holbrook, yes, I knew him. I can't get his voice out of my head. I still hear it, saying, "You haven't read that book, you really need to read it." Saying, "I feel, and I hope this doesn't sound too self-satisfied, that in a very difficult situation where nobody has the answer, I at least know what the overall questions and moving parts are." Or saying, "I gotta go, Hillary's on the line." That voice, calm, nasal, a trace of older New York, a sing-song cadence when he was being playful, but always doing something to you, cajoling, flattering, bullying, seducing, needling, analyzing, one-upping you, applying continuous pressure like a strong underwater current, so that by the end of a conversation, even 2 minutes on the phone, you found yourself far out from where you'd started, unsure how you got there, and mysteriously exhausted. So for me, Holbrook was like the perfect character to explore what happened in this country between Vietnam and Afghanistan, which were the wars that bookended his career. And he was so, there was something so available and open that I could actually almost make him my own. Whereas if he's already president or secretary of state, it's too late. He's a marble figure, and all I can do is tell everyone what they already know about him. This was something I could invent. And like the voice of that narrator is an invention. I actually didn't really know him very well, but you can feel from this narrative voice that this is someone who seems to have been almost like a friend or a colleague. There are no false statements, but the tone of it is like you're at a bar and someone asks you, "Did you know Holbrook?" And the guy says, "Yeah, I knew him. Sit down, have a drink, and I'll tell you about him." And that's the way the book goes.
Just one follow-up. You say something very striking and maybe quite deep about Holbrook, but you say it about not just Holbrook, but all of us and our country. You say at times you used to think if he could have just gotten rid of some of his flaws, some of his vices, like his narcissism,
His egotism.
He could have been not just almost great, but great. And then you realize, wait a second, his flaws were inextricably tied to his virtues and vices. You couldn't get rid of one.
If you fix that thing that was wrong with him, you might have killed the thing that made him almost great. And isn't that true of all of us? Mm-hmm. The thing that everyone says, if only they weren't like this, then I could really admire them or I could think they were a great person, is probably the thing that is making you do what other people admire. It's inextricable. You can't cut out one part of yourself and fix it and become a better person because it's all tied together.
yeah, I think we need to.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So why don't we open this up to questions from you all? So I see a number of hands already going up. Do you want me to?
Yeah, you go ahead.
So Willow. Just a little louder, Willow, if you can.
Since one of your main concerns is inequality and how it's been a presence in our country, given that the Supreme Court is a very close term to affirmative action, I was wondering to speak on that and affirmative action from the
I missed some of that.
equality in its absence.
I think the question was, I think Willow was asking you to speak on the recent oral argument about race-based, race-conscious admissions policy.
Right. We were talking about this at dinner. I mean, it's going to be a huge.
And actually, so, I'm sorry, I think Willow was also to connect that to the issue of inequality.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
How that affects.
Affirmative action, as you probably know, was a policy that began during the Johnson administration in the 1960s. And as Johnson said, you can't tell a man who's had shackles on all his life, the shackles are off you now. Get to the starting line and run the race. It's a false promise. And how long was affirmative action going to be in place? I mean, Sandra Day O'Connor, I think around the year 2000 said maybe 25 more years. Like there's a fixed time limit. The key moment in all of this was the Bakke Supreme Court decision in, I think, 78 or 79, which ruled out quotas as being against the Civil Rights Act. You cannot base admissions on racial quotas, but diversity is a factor in what universities and schools can factor in when they make their decisions about admissions. And I think the Supreme Court, as you say, is about to say no, that diversity is a weak, and as Clarence Thomas said, I don't even know what diversity means. They're going to get rid of it. What's that going to mean? I mean, as I've been talking to some of your administrators and professors today, I think it's going to mean a drastic drop in how many black students especially are at a place like Amherst. What I've heard is it's going to go down from 14% to 5%, which is an enormous change in who's here and who they have to see here as being people, you know, from a similar background or of a similar identity who can provide a kind of a sense of belonging. So that happened in California when the state of California got rid of affirmative action. It was drastic. Gradually it began to rise again. And my thought is, why can't Amherst College say, okay, color is no longer a factor, but class is a factor, and the bottom 20% of Americans have a claim on us because they have everything going against them as far as getting into a college like Amherst. Will that keep the same racial composition? Probably not, at least not at the start, but it might make the resulting inequality that comes from the end of affirmative action less drastic and maybe even more just. So I don't know what your president and other leaders of academic institutions are going to do, but it seems like we're headed for that waterfall, and I hope they're thinking about it really hard, because the other answer is for Amherst and other colleges to go back to being what they were, you know, before I was born, long time ago, when they were essentially, with some exceptions, havens for the well-connected and the wealthy.
Since you called me out, we are thinking very hard, and we are not going to that.
Glad to hear it.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. So about a year ago, you wrote that you thought the left, as well as the Republican establishment, were sort of underestimating the resurgence of Trump, and we're sort of like celebrating like the victory of Biden in 2020, and we're kind of acting like some of the problems that we saw with Trump are being fixed. And I'm wondering, you talked about there needing to be some sort of massive coalition between the center right and the Democrats, and I'm just wondering whether in the past year how you think that dynamic has changed, especially headed into the midterms, and specifically in regards to the Democratic strategy we saw with the DNC propping up like MAGA candidates in a lot of races in hopes that those candidates would be easier to beat, and that sort of now seems like it may have backfired, and I'm just kind of wondering what you think.
So you're asking me kind of to be a bit of a political consultant, handicapper, which is not how I see myself, but it's a very legitimate question. First of all, it turns out there just isn't much of a center-right left in this country. Like, the never-Trump Republican is extremely conspicuous at the Atlantic, but does not win elections. And the proof is the fact that Liz Cheney is going to be looking for another job, and that Adam Kinzinger is going to be looking for another job. The very few Republicans in elected office who have stood up to Trump are basically dinosaurs. The Republican Party is Trump's party. Some people will kind of try to work around him. Some people will accept this and be quiet about that. But basically, what we're learning in this midterm is January 6th changed nothing. Nothing. The Republican Party fell in line regardless of whether their leader tried to stage an anti-democratic coup or not. We have to face that as a fact. So as a coalition, Democrats and Never Trumpers, to me, is basically Democrats, plus 0.001%. Have the Democrats run a good midterm campaign? Not very. Have they figured out what issues are most important to voters? Not really. Have they sold their own accomplishments, which have been considerable? No. So it looks like it's going to be a bad midterm, which is historically the case for the party in power. But remind me of the second half of your question.
Sort of, I guess the answer is.
Yeah, yeah,
Like,
answer.
if you thought the dynamic of like your response about the disappearance of the Senate, I think.
Yeah, it's responsive.
Yeah. I think the Republican Party is MAGA. It's MAGA. And that's where the energy is, it's where the youth is, it's where the new faces are. And a shocking number of conspiracy-minded election denialists are going to win office next week, which has huge consequences for 2024.
Ooh, I get to choose.
She had her hand up for quite a while. Yeah.
Yeah.
You.
Hello. Thank you. Is it on? Good.
Yeah,
Okay.
we're here.
So I was thinking back to your comments on like self-censorship and how that's kind of emerged today. And I guess I have more of an understanding of how that kind of issue and this kind of return to a reliance on like a cliche or a stock phrase would emerge in like an authoritarian or totalitarian system of governance. But I found it really intriguing how you applied that to modern politics. I guess I'm hesitant to think that that's fully a condition of like modern partisanism and social media. So I'm wondering if you think there's like a deeper issue or problem within American governance or society that has contributed to self-censorship, because I'm hesitant to believe that it's entirely a modern phenomenon given how deeply implicated it seems to be today.
Well, that's a good question, but let me ask you, how many of you feel that you can say what you think in class? Raise your hand. Say pretty much whatever you think, leaving aside, I don't like, the way he's dressed today or whatever. So that's a pretty small number. How many of you feel you have to think hard about what you say and fear the consequences of saying something that is simply going to be unacceptable to some of your classmates? Okay, there's a whole lot in the middle.
And how many are you too scared to answer the question?
Yeah. I mean, there are polls that show that majorities of Americans are afraid to voice their views because of the possible detrimental consequences. I bet here at Amherst, the majority of you are a little bit tense about whether you can say what you think in class. I may be wrong, but I'm guessing that that's true. Are you afraid to tell me that? So why is that the case? What has happened? Was there a golden age when I was in college, we could say whatever we thought? I do think it was more wide open. But I also know that when I was in college, more people looked like me than are in college now. So maybe I felt more comfortable because I looked around and saw more people who looked like me. That's a big factor in this. But I also think, not just because of social media, but because of cultural shifts on the right and the left. Cancel culture is not a left-wing phenomenon. It's an American phenomenon. The right cancels people all the time. It just doesn't happen in colleges. It happens in politics or in business. Why is that happening? Or even is it happening? You're kind of asking, is it really new? I do think it's new. I do. I'm not sure I can prove it statistically, although there have been polls showing that there's a lot of self-censorship. I feel it in myself, let's just say that. Over the course of like a 20-year career in journalism, I felt the boundaries of what I could write for leading publications, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, closing in on me. And I felt my stomach knotting up a bit as I wrote in a way that wasn't true when I was starting out. And I had to ask myself, why is this? Is it, good? Is it bad? Who's doing it? I don't think there's any central committee that's imposing this. It's in the air. It's in our social world. We are social animals, and we care about what other people think. And there's a deep aversion to going against what others, especially the most vocal, think, so that a vocal minority can have a lot of power over what are the acceptable parameters of what you can say. I think it's just unquestionable that that has become stronger in the last few years. The mistake is to think it's just a problem of kids at Amherst. It's a problem throughout our society.
Leo, and what's your? Right, Jim.
Yeah, to your point about like the never Trumpers are like 0.001%. Does that mean that like the free America doesn't exist anymore, or did it ever exist?
It's a great question. It exists, but it is not the engine of the Republican Party any longer. It's like the party. I have a line in my book, in Last Best Hope, it's like in a funhouse mirror where the body and the head have been separated and still seem to be moving as if they're attached, but they're actually apart. The head, Free America, still writes the legislation. What was the only major bill that Trump passed? Tax cuts. That's Free America. Why was that the only bill? Because that's what the leaders in Congress wanted, and Trump wasn't a good enough president to get anything else done, and maybe didn't care enough. But the body is not about tax cuts. Tax cuts don't win in polling. The body wants the wall built. It wants abortion banned. It wants schools to teach exactly what parents in certain areas want taught. It wants books taken out of libraries. It wants masking and vaccination regulations to be removed, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the energy of the party. But the elite of the party are still there. They're still in power. They're in Congress. They're at the Wall Street Journal. They're at the Cato Institute. Essentially, you could say the libertarian Republican Party. It's still there, and it's saying the same thing it's been saying for 40 years, regardless of whatever massive changes have occurred in our economy and in our society. And that's one reason it's lost its hold on the Republican voter, because it's irrelevant to the present. It's acting as if the year is still 1981, but it's still there in positions of power, but less and less. Kevin McCarthy, who will be the next Speaker of the House, is he a product of Free America? Yeah, you could hear him talking tax cuts. But if his members want to see an investigation of voting irregularity in Arizona, he's not going to stand in the way of that. He's not going to stand in the way of making open carry the law of the land, or of even a national law banning abortion. He's not going to stand in the way of that, even though the older Republican Party, the Free America Republican Party, would not have done those things, because he just wants power, and the power right now is with the grassroots, and that's real America.
Jane?
Hi. I guess my question is, do you feel as if there is almost like a timer on the solution of like coalition building and stuff like that?
Wow.
Because if you were to ask, like, let's say like this room, right, whether you think Joe Biden is like a good president, you probably would say, but
Yeah.
he at the same time has been like the most successful legislator and like the most prone to building coalitions and compromising and like taking good over perfect. And if you were to ask about AOC, you know, like an older person might go, you know, I don't know. But younger people might think she's the only honest Democrat in like Congress, right? So what happens when these people
Are gone.
Yeah, yes, are gone. That's a nice way to put it.
That's a great question. What happens when the dinosaurs who believe in compromise and coalitions are extinct and the Earth is ruled by the AOCs and the MGTs? Will that happen, I guess, is a question. Or will the younger legislators, the younger politicians begin to realize that they're not getting anything done without compromise, without coalitions, which are kind of the only, I mean, we are not a country we're not a parliamentary system. We do not rule by simple, one single party having its way without regard to the losers. We have to have some kind of cross-party fertilization, or else it's very short-term. It's over within 2 years. So one answer would be if younger politicians learn. Another answer would be if voters get tired of the Twitter branding politicians and realize that they're actually not getting much done, and instead start voting for the colorless, moderate, pragmatic, problem-solving caucus type of politicians. Right now, that's not who we are. Voters seem to want just to be inflamed, to be excited, to be pissed off by the by the issues and by the people running for office. So it doesn't seem like it's going to happen anytime soon. My worry is, well, I have a couple of worries, but my biggest worry is in 2024, we will have a constitutional crisis in which Trump and Biden run again, and if Trump loses, he refuses to accept it. And this time around, secretaries of state and county commissioners and Republican judges and Congress don't do what they did last time and instead throw out the results. And then we have something like, I don't want to say civil war, but we have a lot of violence in the streets. And that seems like a very likely scenario. I don't see anything turning us away from that right now. I thought Biden, my last best hope was for Biden to get enough done that would improve the lives of enough people who would realize that politics still works and we have to play by the rules in order to make people's lives better. And in a way, in a normal era, you could say he did that. I think you made that point. He did that. There's going to be a lot of jobs created in Ohio by the Inflation Reduction Act and by the CHIPS Act. But do voters know about those? Do they care? Is that what they're seeing on cable news and on social media? No. So in this era, I don't think that's going to be enough to lower the temperature. I thought that might, and that's why my book ends with a bunch of ideas for how to essentially create a more equal society in which everyone feels as if they actually belong. I don't see that happening. Even if the concrete results are moving in that direction, I don't see that happening because people are living in their narratives, and their narratives are more and more extreme. So, yeah. And I know the last thing you want to hear is, oh, it's up to your generation, right? Don't you hate hearing that? I know my children, whenever I say, we've left a lot of problems for you to solve, but we're counting on you to solve them, they say, thanks a lot. That's sort of where you are. Thanks a lot. And yet it's kind of true.
Yeah, my kids say, F you. Yeah, that's basically what.
I don't tolerate that in my house.
Yeah. Oh, they're older also.
Okay.
So anyway. But yeah, so we have Yeah.
So you end kind of the free speech conversation with this distinction between intellectual critique and silencing people, like endorsing the former one. But isn't that kind of your idea of the failure of democratic politics in terms of the failure to like deal with narratives and identity? And that like they treat voters as like rational class actors or rational actors in general? Like if politics is narrative driven, shouldn't we deal with some narratives as dangerous entities, therefore like words causing harm? I guess that's the question.
I'm all for arguing against narratives, but I'm very hesitant to tell anyone what you're saying is an act of violence, as I said earlier. To me, that's just a weapon that will easily be turned against me, and that is, let's just say, anti-democratic. So do some narrative, does real America cause harm? Yes, it does. Does that mean we shouldn't listen to anything of it? We should dismiss everyone who is of that orientation. We should decide that they're in some ways evil or existential threats? I'm really hesitant to go that far because basically we're all quarantined together. Like at the start of my book, I quote a friend who said, "My family are not the people I would have chosen to be quarantined with." Maybe some people in this room felt that way. We are stuck with each other. So once you have decided these people are beyond the pale, and some people are beyond the pale, there is no doubt. But I prefer to have a kind of limited range of people I'm going to declare to be beyond the pale. The further out it gets, the more people that includes, the less likely we're going to be a country I want to live in because we're stuck with each other. So I don't, arguing against a narrative and declaring it harmful and therefore beyond the pale, those are two different things, and I'm hesitant to cross that line. Sometimes you have to. But be aware when you do that what you're doing is actually making your life harder, not easier. Because you're declaring people you have to live with, your own family, beyond the pale. And yet you're in the same house. You can see why that can be a problem.
Can I just follow up very briefly on that? Because I thought maybe one thing you were also asking was the degree to which you can answer.
A lunatic idea, there's no basis for it, you're completely out of touch with reality, that's false. No, you have to say that. You have to. Then what do you do with the person? If they're inclined toward violence, they're beyond the pale. That's, for me, the line. If they are lunatic conspiracy theorists, it's going to be really hard to reach them. My perhaps unrealistic hope is that if we improve the conditions in which people live, over time it will start to drain the poison out of the body politic. I don't know if that's true. It may be that that's totally naive Pollyannish thinking, and in fact these lies that have circulated are going to be there forever and there's nothing to be done about them. But I don't know another way, because obviously arguing rationally doesn't work. These are totally irrational points of view, and declaring people beyond the pale and then somehow exiling them from the political community is a dangerous thing to do. So my only third way is to try to pass policies, laws that will gradually give people the feeling that they belong, that they're not being left behind, that they're not being consigned to a miserable life. And some people might respond to that, and other people will continue to hold hateful and crazy ideas. And the other answer is to beat their party again and again and again, to deliver defeat to the party that lives off those ideas again and again and again, until that party realizes we might need to start changing the way we run elections. That's, to me, the whole game. And it doesn't happen by wishing that the Senate didn't exist. It happens the old hard way, by organizing, by talking, by knocking on doors, by running for office, and by slowly trying to bring a majority to your side. That's the best answer, to make it hurt politically for a party to base itself on lies and bigotry.
I think we have time for one last question. Do you want to?
You're going to have to do this.
Okay,
How about two last questions?
two last questions. I saw Jacob I saw him early on, and then over here, Lucchini. I don't know, but sorry.
I was just wondering what your thoughts are on the possible indictment and prosecution of former President Donald Trump. Would that just be permanently alienating a part of the population? Would we be burning bridges, or is that what the rule of law commands out of us morally?
Both are true, I think. So it's a tough choice. But I don't see how you make an exception for him. What does that encourage? What are the incentives to go on doing it? And who are you actually trying to win over? Because anyone who is going to decide, the Justice Department is going after Trump, that's it. I'm not going to vote for Biden. Do you think there are very many people left who are like that? I don't think so. It does hand MAGA a weapon to say, you did it to us, so we're going to do it to you. But he was talking about doing it with lock her up in 2016 without knowing why he was going to lock her up. He was just going to do it. And he'll do it again he did it with Biden in 2020. Do you know, he gave a speech that most people missed, where he said, yeah, lock him up, both Bidens, Hunter and Joe. It was another day in the news. Trump calling for his opponent to be locked up. It's not going to change very much. I just think the political repercussions are not nearly worrying enough to throw out the rule of law and say that if a president does it, it's okay. You probably are too young to remember Nixon, after he left office, being interviewed by David Frost. And the most famous moment in like 10 hours of interviews was when Nixon said, if the president does it, that means it's okay. And that was like, the smoking gun. The guy doesn't believe the rule of law applies to the president. That's it. Now, that's an entire argument for re-election. So I don't want to see our standards slip that low, where we're saying what costs Nixon everything is, for Trump, an argument for why we have to re-elect him. So yeah, I think if the law and the evidence say prosecute, then prosecute.
Okay.
One more?
One more? Yeah, Lucchini?
Thank you, Professor. There have been two questions on a similar note, but it's a phenomenon that is happening everywhere, not only in America, but also in Italy, in Brazil, and Hungary, even in Sweden.
Even Sweden.
Even Sweden, yes. It's the radicalization of the right wing.
Yeah.
And as someone who's interested in politics, I see that maybe the only possible way out of this would be the reconstruction of the traditional, neoliberal right. And how do we do this in first place? Because, for instance, the elections just happened in Brazil, and regarding the Senate, the left wing was able to stand their ground and maintain a similar amount of representatives, but as for the right went even more to the right, and how can we fix that?
So what you're saying is, free Brazil or free America needs to return to some kind of dominance on the right, or else we're stuck with right-wing populism, which is Bolsonaro, which is Trump, which is the current government in Italy, and the newly empowered Sweden Democrats. I don't think history works that way. I think neoliberalism, which was essentially the free market ideology of the post-war, has had its day. And the reason why we have right-wing populism is because, partly, there are lots of factors in all these countries, and immigration is a major one, but partly it's because capitalism did not bring benefits to enough people in those countries who had felt they had a secure place before, that they're willing to continue with a system of free trade and small government and low taxes, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know that you can rebuild that. I don't see how you're going to persuade enough voters that this is actually the best future for them when they've seen it hollow out their communities, their main streets, their schools, et cetera. But you're right, it's happening all across the kind of major democracies, the more developed democracies, from Brazil to Sweden. And the question is why? And I think it's partly because of the economic collapse of the old industrial working class, but it's also partly because of a huge cultural gap that's opened up between that working class and the urban educated class, which has moved into a set of views and positions and identities that are alien, that seem like way too much change, way too fast to that older working class. That's true in France, it's true in Germany, and it's true here. What do you do about that? Do you put the brakes on cultural change? Whose rights are you going to take away in order to please the old working class? I'm not sure that's the answer either. I honestly don't have an answer. I think it's a problem that's with us right now, and that if you think of yourself as a progressive, the worst thing you can do is to consider them not worth thinking about because they have retrograde ideas, or they are in a part of the country or a part of the economy that's obviously doomed. That's the way you ensure a backlash that's gonna hurt you. I don't know if there's a political answer, in a set of policies or coalitions. I told you earlier that my faint hope is that material changes will gradually lower the fever of anger in the right-wing working class, but I'm not sure that's true. So I don't really have an answer, but it's a huge problem, and it's one that urban, educated, professional types can't ignore. It's just gonna keep coming back. So probably we should banish the word deplorable for large numbers of people. You can use it for like Trump. I use it, I have much worse words for Trump, but I wouldn't use it for 74 million Americans. I think that is probably the way to make sure that you lose power.
We're going to have to end. So before we all thank George Packer for his really generous and wonderful conversation, I just want to remind you two things. One is Tuesday is Election Day, so I hope those of you who can vote perform your civic responsibility and cast a ballot. And also, after you do so, what better way to celebrate than to come back here and for the Daniel Allen event, again, which will be here at 7:30 to 9 this coming Tuesday. So again, thanks so much.